Authentication, authentication was a very huge deal, because for every application developed by, your developers or your software engineers for any organization, you definitely have to work on the authentication part, whereby people will have to, log into the application, as we generally would know. Okay, so the reason why we have Active Directory is actually based on this premise, right? It was done differently long time ago. Just like I illustrated, I said before log into any application, definitely you would authenticate. Well, how was authentication done? Okay, before we move into Microsoft Entra. Way back in the days, software developers usually create, this database. And in this database, you have your username, you have your passwords, right? The credentials in general. In the sense that for a user to log into an application, it's more like a client, client server approach. If you can see in this my diagram. For a user to authenticate, the client will have to talk to the server, and the server will now have to do what? Communicate with the database. And when the server communicates with the database, what's the server looking for? The server has actually picked the client's credential and is trying to match it with what is on the database storage here. So for instance, now I'm logging in with my username and password, and I send it to the server, and the server sends it to the database. Is this username and password existing? Naturally, if it is not existing, the database will talk back to the server, and the server will report back to the client with an error message and say invalid user password, right? Invalid user name or password, something like that. But if it matches, of course, we all know what's going to happen. There will be a green tick, or congratulations, you just got logged in, or you just signed in or something. So that was how it was done, just straightforward client to server kind of thing, and storage and all that. However, there were drawbacks to this approach. Like you can see, this is a classic approach, right? And what are the types of, or what are the drawbacks before the advent of Azure Active Directory or Active Directory as a whole? The drawbacks was, number one, it was very, very expensive. Whenever an organization is designing an application, they have to focus, on developing the storage and all of that. So it was expensive, because you have to put in a lot. You have to even hire more back-end engineers that are very good with all this kind of, storage or server SQL kind of thing. Not only was it expensive, it took longer time to build. Do you get? You have to ensure that you're doing what you're doing right, Abby. So you have to put in more time. You have to put in more money into it, just to ensure that it works. So back in the days, it was quite expensive for an organization to maintain just an authentication kind of, structure. It was very difficult. It took a longer time to develop. It took a lot of money. And of course, it wasn't really effective. Now, there were a lot of things involved. You cannot just expose your database to the world, right? You have to do a lot of security checks, since this database is actually hosted within your company's on-premise location, or your company's private cloud, right? So there's a lot of, excuse me, there is a lot of checks done here and there. However, this is this is how a company handle their thing, and of course it's not going to be so perfect. There will be loopholes here and there, and it exposes it to what? To hackers. And before you know what is happening, company's credential is here and there. And we all know that the weakest link, or an organization's security is as strong as the weakest link, right? And the weakest link, of course, are those employees that we don't even know that they would be the ones to expose the company's data out there. So this was the challenge, right? It took longer time. It was just too difficult to maintain. There was a lot of security loopholes here and there. And because of these difficulties, faced by the developers and companies in general to develop an enterprise application or any kind of application, the advent of an identity provider or anything that has to do like an identity provider kind of architecture, the advent of that thing was now birthed, in the sense that people found it difficult to manage their identity structure or infrastructure, however you may call it, right? And then Microsoft, being one of the leading identity providers, took it upon themselves to think beyond beyond the box and was like, oh, we can handle something like this now. Why don't we make it a managed service where we sell it, as a managed service, and we help people maintain. We have the right infrastructure, we have everything. So why don't we just come together and do it? And that was how Microsoft started managing what identity for organization. However, you understand that it's not all about the managing of the identity, right? The classic approach actually had drawbacks. So Microsoft had to work on these drawbacks. So what did they do? This is what a typical identity provider structure looks like using Microsoft Azure Active Directory or the Microsoft Active Directory domain services, which is the on-prem version. What happens is no longer will the client, talk to the server and the server checks the database and goes back like that. So what happens here is the client talks to Microsoft, right? And Microsoft in turn gives the client a token, and the client serves this Microsoft trusted server that token. And once that token is confirmed to be from Microsoft identity provider system, it returns a yes, or it returns an authentication, as long as, of course, the user information is correct, right? So no longer was the user sending their credentials directly to servers and the normal approach. They sent their credentials to Microsoft Azure Active Directory. I'm just using Azure, which is a cloud-based one, right? As an example. And in turn, it sends them a token and the token back to the server and the database and back and forth like that. So this architecture, or this approach, actually solved a lot of issues. Number one, it took off the heavy burden of organization thinking of developing an infrastructure that will manage their identity, right? Why can't they just pay for it from an organization that has what it takes, not just to design this infrastructure, but also to maintain it? Remember, when we were handling it before, we had to what? We had to maintain it, which includes updating the application, updating the database, ensuring all those stuff. But now Microsoft has lifted up that heavy burden, and now it's left for Microsoft, to manage all those parts. And we all know that Microsoft is very big on security. Microsoft is not a small company, right? Microsoft is a very big company when it comes to infrastructure, human resource, finance, and all that it takes to create a very, robust infrastructure that can help manage, identity and security. So this is exactly what Microsoft thought about, and they started selling to organizations that needs it. Of course, Microsoft is not the only identity provider that exists. We have Google, we have Okta, we have, there Apple. There are so many identity providers out there. However, because we are narrowing it down to this class, we are discussing Microsoft Microsoft Active Directory. So Microsoft Active Directory is actually divided into two parts, major parts, right? We have the on-prem and we have the cloud. So when you hear Microsoft Azure Active Directory, it's usually just called Azure Active Directory, right? You're referring to the cloud-based identity management system. Then when you hear Azure Active Directory domain services, we are referring to what? The on-prem version of the identity management system. Some of us, because of our experience, we must have seen, how the look and feel of the on-prem Azure Active Directory, sorry, of the on-prem Microsoft Active Directory. And some of us too, we must have seen how the cloud-based, which is Azure, looks like. So presently, I will be using or mentioning Microsoft Entra ID for Azure and Microsoft Active Directory domain services for the on-prem. So instead of saying Azure Active Directory, I'll just say Entra ID because that's what it is now. Okay, there's nothing like Azure Active Directory anymore. It has been changed to Microsoft Entra. Okay, so now let's go back. What is Microsoft Entra? You see, Microsoft Entra is that cloud identity management system provided by Microsoft to ensure that companies are able to manage their users, groups, identity in general. Anything that has to do with identity, be it a user, be it a group, be it a device, right? You are able to manage it and maintain it properly using Microsoft solution or cloud solution called Entra ID. So we have so many features, of this particular solution. We have the users and the groups, we have the devices, we have the security parts, and so many other things, right, involved. So without much ado, I'd like to close this slide because it's not on this slide. I would like us to talk about the subscription that would allow us or enable us use this particular service. So Entra ID subscription. Very good. I actually thought I opened it up earlier, but obviously not. So we can see that it comes in 4 variances or 4 parts. Yeah, we have the free one. Of course, the free one, everybody that registers with Microsoft 365, Microsoft Azure, Dynamics, and all that, you are entitled to what? This particular free Microsoft Entra ID because it's free, right? And with this free one, you can do what? You can create users and you can create groups. You can assign licenses to these users, and that's all you can do with it, right? Microsoft doesn't want you to just stay in the free category whereby you just be creating users and group. Of course, as your business grows, the need to manage your identity security-wise becomes compulsory, not an option. Yeah. So that's why we now have Microsoft Entra ID P1, Microsoft Entra ID P2, Microsoft Entra ID Governance. Okay. So this governance is a total different thing. It's not really what we'll be discussing about. But we'll definitely look at one or two out of it. Okay. So let's just look at this P1. This P1 starts for Premium 1. And this stands for Premium 2. Okay, so what do we have, or what do you stand to get when you have the P1 and the P2? So naturally, the P1 comes with, you can see it, administration and hybrid identity, end user, self-service, just like the P2. But anywhere you see that this is highlighted somehow whitish blue, it means that it has a partial service, while this one that is thick in deep blue or black, I think it's deep blue, it means that this one has the full service that's actually highlighted here. So for end user self-service, you can see the difference here. For P1, it has a very long list, and for P2, very, very long list. The only difference is that self-service entitlement management access is actually not available for P1 and free, but it's definitely available for P2. So if you are Microsoft Microsoft administrator or Microsoft administrator to be, you should understand the differences between these licenses, because it's not everybody that is entitled to everything on Entra ID. All right. You need to let your organization know that, okay, yes, we have the free version, but what can the free version offer your organization? Is it meeting their need? Is it meeting their identity need? Is it meeting their security need? And all of that. So this is the reason why it's always necessary to talk about the subscription part. So you can always see P1 and P2 as part of the enterprise, subscriptions. That's the E3 and the E5, right? That's where you see your P1 and P2. But the free one comes, of course, with your basic license, your free, anything that you're not really paying so much for this identity management. And that's where you have the free one. If you just register, for a free Microsoft, probably a business basic, or let's just use business basic as an example. So you get the free one, okay? But all these other ones comes with an enterprise license. All right, so that is about the subscription part. So let's look at what we can get, or what the Entra ID, looks like, and the features that are there, which is the reason why we are here. All right. So how do we get here in the first place? There are two ways to get here. It's either you go into your admin.microsoft.com portal. When you type in admin.microsoft.com, it's going to bring you to this general admin center view. And then you can go ahead to click on show all. Then when you click on show all, you can scroll down, and you can go ahead to click on identity, or you click on all. Sorry, I think my mouse is a little bit messed up right now. So you click on all admin center, and then you'd see Microsoft Entra, or you can come in here and type in Microsoft Entra. It's going to bring it out, right? Or you can just type entra.microsoft.com. And if you have access to the Entra, it definitely will take you to this portal. So this is what the Microsoft Entra Admin Center looks like. As you can see in the left-hand menu, we have the overview, we have users, we have all users. So I love the progression, yeah? It progressed from the simplest of things to, to very complex stuff, which is good. So if you're the one that just have the free one, you can always do what? You can always be entitled to users, groups, and all of that. You can create a lot from that, yes? So the backbone of identity management for Microsoft application is where you have Microsoft Entra Admin Center, because this is what manages your credentials, not about your mailboxes, but how you actually log into Microsoft applications or your company applications, because you can actually use Microsoft as an identity provider for third-party applications. Could be an ERP, it could be a CRM, it could be something totally not Microsoft related, but you can actually bring it into Microsoft and sign in with the same password, user ID and password. Yes, that's this thing I just mentioned about user, the same user ID and password just took me back to something I did not mention. Part of the drawbacks of, the classic approach, how it was formerly client to server, one of the drawbacks, aside being too expensive, too long, and too difficult to maintain, is that you would have to learn how to use a lot of passwords for your applications, because there is no identity management system to help you, use one single user credentials for all your applications. You need to know the password for Entra, password for Exchange, password for, Google, password for, you have to know. And if you're a very, very poor, password manager, you definitely use, one password for all your applications just because you don't want to forget them, which is very wrong, because as soon as one gets compromised, automatically the hacker, you won't know that yours has gotten compromised then, aside now that you're having Google prompts, Microsoft prompts, that's prompting us that it's like our password have been leaked and all that. Formerly, you won't get all those stuff. So you won't even know that your password or your credentials have been, sold in the dark web, and hackers are actually using it to do a lot. All you just be seeing is the results of what's happening. Yeah.